right, now let's talk about thermal damage and fatigue life, mostly in steels. I mean, fatigue applies to a lot of materials, but typically we think of it in terms of steels. And fatigue life defined is this. If I take a chunk of metal, and this one just happens to be a cutting tool, but let's just say it's just a solid shaft, and I put it under some kind of cyclic load, just stress, no stress, stress, no stress, stress, no stress. We haven't passed the yield stress. There's no deformation. We're just kind of moving the guy back and forth, stressing him, not stressing him, millions and millions of times. Now, when we do that, he will eventually break, depending on what that stress is. So what we have is a curve that defines this phenomenon quite nicely. And that curve is this. This was done by some guys named Field and Calls. They did a lot of good work in the 70s on this subject. And let's take a look at what this actually entails. So here we have the stress that's applied to the workpiece in thousands of psi, or in this case we've got it in megapascal. And then this is the number of cycles that we get until the thing breaks. Okay, so let's start with the red curve. So we grind a shaft, we grind something, and then we say, okay, we are going to put a big load on it. So we're going to put 1100 megapascals of stress, cyclic stress. It's not just a steady 1100, it's on, off, on, off, on, off. If we do that, we will get maybe 20,000 cycles before the guy breaks. If we put a lower stress, now let's say we only put 900 megapascals, now we're going to get pushing maybe 100,000 cycles before the guy breaks. So we get more cyclic loading, more cycles, on, off, on, off, on, off, on, off, until the guy eventually breaks. And then if we get a below around, let's say 750 megapascals, we can pretty much go forever and the thing will never break. Okay? Now that's the red curve. But if we grind this guy abusively, and it depends on how you define abusively, we'll talk about that in a minute, but we abusively can mean we have thermal softening, the workpiece becomes soft, we have residual tensile stresses, or we have rehardening burn, all things that occur at high temperatures, and they damage the integrity of the steel. But if we have abusive grinding, now look at this curve, we get a shift. So if we apply just 700 megapascals, if we don't abusively grind the guy, you can pretty much go forever, but now we're only going to get about 30,000 cycles before he breaks. And if we apply 600 megapascals, we're going to get only about 100,000. And then that cutoff point where we can cycle it forever before he breaks is now not 770 megapascals, it's only 500. Okay, so the moral of the story so far is if you burn the workpiece, depending on how you define burn, this guy is not going to have as many cycles before he eventually breaks. Or we're going to have to apply a lower, if we want to guarantee the thing will never break due to fatigue, we're going to have to apply a much lower cyclical stress before the guy eventually cracks up. Okay, now, how do you define abusive grinding? So abusive grinding can take many forms. Number one is we can get thermal softening. And we talk about this a lot in the book of grinding on the different types of thermal damage, but thermal softening is the least bad of all of them. And basically temperatures get high enough to where we get a drop in hardness at the surface. Sometimes that's a big drop in hardness, sometimes it's a small drop in hardness, but we get some kind of drop. Above that, we get residual tensile stresses, which is this complicated phenomenon where the workpiece expands and it expands, but it's constricted by the material around it, so we get permanent plastic deformation in compression, and then when it cools, it wants to expand to a larger size, gets a little complicated. That is the a little bit worse type of thermal damage. And then the worst type of thermal damage in steels is what's called rehardening burn, where you actually get a phase change in the material. So this is some kind of drill bit or end mill, and we have the flute grinding operation here. We got two flutes, and what we have is the white layer, some people call it, and the white layer is where the steel has changed phase. It hasn't melted, but all those little molecules in that crystal structure change phase and they realign to a different crystal structure. We have body-centered cubic, face-centered cubic, stuff like that. So now we have the temperature got above the austenitizing temperature. So now we're getting a phase change in the material, and this material is now harder, but it's brittle. Brittle materials like to crack. So this can give us big issues, especially in terms of fatigue life. And if you know anything, here's a picture of the white layer here. So this is the ground surface. And then here's the workpiece. This is the ground surface. Temperatures got super hot here, pretty hot here, not quite as hot here, sort of hot, and not too hot. So what we have is rehardening burn, a little bit of softening here, and then we have unchanged material. Okay, now this material is hard and brittle. So what happens if we put this material under cyclic loading? Now, here's a phase diagram for iron plus carbon. If you're into metallurgy and you understand this, you get above the austenitizing temperature, somewhere around 700 degrees C. You could argue it's higher than that, but somewhere in that ballpark. If the grinding temperature in the workpiece gets above 700 degrees C, you're going to get that phase change in the material. It might be a micron deep, it might be a millimeter deep, depending on how you grind, but you get that, and then you have that hard, brittle material at the surface. Now, if you got that hard, brittle material at the surface, what's going to happen? Some guys did some tests back in 1983. Just happens to be my old PhD advisor, Andrew Torrance. We used to call him Dr. T. And he wrote this paper, The Effect of Grinding Conditions on the Rolling Contact Fatigue Life of Bearing Steel. So that's what Dr. T did. Some people confuse him with Mr. T. So we have that picture there to make sure that no one gets confused between the two. I don't know if he did any work on fatigue life and grinding. I haven't seen any, but it's possible. So here we have what Dr. T did. And what he found, this gets a little tricky about the way he did it, the actual specific energy, where the specific energy where rehardening burn occurs. You could argue it's just kind of temperature. If you don't have rehardening burn, you're going to get 45 hours of life, of fatigue life, before the thing breaks. If you're right on the edge of rehardening burn, probably a little bit of residual tensile stress, but not rehardening burn yet, you're still doing okay. But as soon as you get rehardening burn, everything goes bad. And now you've weakened that material so much, it's brittle, and now your fatigue life just goes terrible down to almost nothing. So the little bit of thermal softening, probably not going to affect the fatigue life much. A little bit of residual tensile stresses can affect the fatigue life, but as soon as you get rehardening burn, trouble. And you're going to get a big drop in the fatigue life of the component. Maybe it's a problem, maybe it's not. It depends on how much stress he's under. It depends how many cycles you're hoping to get out of the guy. But really this shows that residual stresses are bad, rehardening burn, real bad. That's the moral of the story.